First, we need to understand that buyers are as emotional as we all are when we go to purchase, and we get stuck not being able to make decisions. And it's not just the rational business case they need to make. I also need to find ways to help them overcome this fear that they might not be able to articulate, whether they will mess up or not.
The Industrial Growth Institute podcast connects you with the big thinkers, makers, and subject matter experts across all aspects of an integrated B2B industrial revenue growth function. From strategy, board oversight, and transactions, through all the phases of manufacturing marketing, the complexities of industrial sales, and the nuances of marketing and sales technology and customer experience, I speak with guests who bring insights, innovative perspectives, best practices, and twists on traditional approaches. Each episode explores high-level thinking and in-the-weeds actionable tactics. If you enjoyed these discussions, then please help me out by liking and sharing the podcast, and especially by leaving a comment and giving a review. So with no further ado, let's jump into this episode. Hello and welcome back to the Industrial Growth Institute podcast. I get to chat with a lot of guests who talk about how to market, to create demand, and how to win deals. Today, we're taking a different approach. We're going to talk about how to avoid losing deals to no decision. And I know that may sound crazy, but the statistics on this are noteworthy. 40%, some research says up to 60% of complex B2B sales almost just evaporate. Some may actually lose because people have decided to consciously and deliberately stick with the status quo for some reason. But after a lot of research, in many cases, a team may just decide that they're not sure that they want to proceed. There could be hesitation due to indecision. Everyone is afraid of making the choice, often with buying teams. And as marketing and sales teams, we need to help buyers get to a yes or a no. I mean, the no can be okay as long as everyone agrees if they're making the decision for the right reasons. But to just kind of have these things wither and die doesn't really do anybody any good. So to talk through this, I'm excited to be joined by somebody who's a really deep thinker on this topic. Ted McKenna is the co-author of the best-selling book. You've probably heard of it, The JOLT Effect, How Higher Performers Overcome Customer Indecision. He's also the founding partner of DCM Insights, one of the founding partners of DCM Insights. He's widely published in academic journals like the Harvard Business Review, and he's a veteran of executive leadership roles in a variety of companies like Tether, Russell Reynolds, and CEB, which is now part of Gartner. But his superpower is probably analyzing behaviors, extracting insights, and then building predictive models and behavioral frameworks around those analytics. So if you've ever slapped yourself on the forehead and asked yourself, what was that prospect thinking? I mean, how did that fall apart? Ted may well have the answer to the question. When you hear him drop these answers along the way, be sure, drop a comment, like the episode, share it with a friend who will also appreciate it. So let's jump in. Ted, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
Yeah, excited to be here, Ed. And my kids might laugh if they heard you tell them that I have a superpower. I'm not sure that.
How old are your kids?
So I have a 17 and a 15-year-old.
So whatever somebody tells me about a 17-year-old that feels that way reminds me of the Mark Twain quote. You know, the one about how when he turned 21, he couldn't believe how much his dad had learned since he was 18. You know, the difference in perspective as you become a young adult, now you look at your parents is always interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we're going to talk about the JOLT effect for much of this conversation. But first, you've got another book coming out in a month, The Activator Advantage. The JOLT effect was certainly transformative. And so it's exciting that, you know, there's another one coming. Talk a little bit about the Activator Advantage.
Sure. I'm a co-author on both. So your audience might know the name Matt Dixon. So Matt Dixon and I are co-authors of The JOLT Effect. They might know Matt's name because he's also co-author of the Challenger Sale, Challenger Customer, Effortless Experience. I was a part of most of those research teams as well. So Matt and I co-authored the JOLT Effect, and we'll talk quite a bit about that. The new book, co-authored with Matt and a couple others, Karen Freeman and Roy Channer. So the Activator Advantage is a big study we did on doer sellers inside of professional services. So those accountants and lawyers and bankers and consultants that your audience might have to work with or choose to work with. I guess it depends on the day, whether that's a have to or a want to situation. But those people have to both sell and then execute on that work too, right? So they're selling you on that accounting, the tax audit that they're looking to run, or the K-1 1065 they're looking to complete, but then also provide strategic guidance from a tax perspective as well. But then you hope that, of course, the promises that they're making in that sales process, they then are the person who are selling their expertise, and they have to stick around. So we did a big study on what do the best people do from a business development perspective when they have to split their time across both execution and sales. And so the study details the findings there. We had a preview article on that probably about 18 months ago or so in Harvard Business Review. You guys can find it called What Today's Rainmakers Do Differently. And so the book, it comes out next month. An expanded set of research to include interviews of firm leaders and other organizations as they look to kind of cultivate those behaviors across the, across their firms and across global organizations.
So obviously the book comes out May 20th, so I haven't read it yet. But reading the HBR article from fall of 23, it breaks out 3 key behaviors that you identified: committing to do biz dev on a consistent, predictable basis, no excuses, get it done. Yep. Being a strong networker and connector for the collective benefit, not just kind of for selfish reasons, trying to collect business cards to have people that you can harass. And actively looking for ways to create value and proactively creating projects instead of just waiting for inquiries. And so certainly, that article, and it sounds like the book, is focused on professional services, but those seem to be common elements across top performers in every industry. Do you see it as something that we can read even if we're not in that space and take lessons from it?
Certainly, yes. So there are definitely parallels to, especially if you're selling any form of service. Okay. There are certainly some parallels there. And I think, as a now co-founder of a couple of different businesses myself, like the sort of the founder and senior executive relationship driven type of sale, even if you might not be the one closing the piece of business, you're often kind of the rainmaker who's coming in and helping to cultivate that relationship. And certainly there are parallels there. Absolutely. I think there's also broader lessons about what's happening with customers and clients that we can draw from as well in the B2B sales environment. So continuing degradation of customer loyalty that has implications for how customers value their interactions and their relationship with service providers in general. And even so it's a profile-based study. So those your audience that's familiar with the Challenger sale, you'll remember that study had 5 different profiles. This one also happened to have 5 because the math kind of dictated that was the case. Different profiles, of course, because it's a different study. But there were a couple of profiles in there that you could kind of look at and say, that one kind of does look like the classic sort of challenger. We called it a debater in this study. And then there's one that we call the realist in this study as well that, definitely shares some traits with that JOLT seller that we'll talk through as well. Right. And so it's kind of interesting to kind of eyeball it and say, well, you could see a little difference, some differences here and there because they're selling to a different audience in a different environment, but perhaps there are some lessons we can kind of draw. I will tell you, just for your audience sake, like the last third of the book, we're talking about firm leaders and cultural shifts and what have you. That one might be a little more specific to professional services, although, broad references to making the habit stick, change management, and what have you.
And what's your gut feeling? Are the fact that this profile that seems to be similar to the Challenger seller and the profile that seems to be similar to the JOLT seller, the fact that those are not as effective as the Activator, do you think it's more specific to professional services, or is this an evolution in the way buyers interact with sellers?
Well, let me start with how we interpret it in professional services. So so there are other profiles that they've got an expert, a confidant, a debater, and a realist. Activator was the only profile that was positively correlated with improvement in performance. And that's, just like Challenger is not meant to say that relationship builders aren't valued or that we shouldn't build relationships. In the same vein, buyers still, of course, value expertise, but it's really about the mentality that you bring to market and how you look about emphasizing it. And what we saw is this sort of dispersion of expertise across the market, and buyers continuing to or starting to value more of sort of an individual who's capable of kind of general contracting that expertise on their behalf across their network, even if it involves third-party individuals, like the banker who knows the accountant or the lawyer who can introduce you to the accountant and so forth. And so I do think there's interesting parallels there in terms of the type of insight, for example, I might share, and how the buyer wants to interact with us between projects, between engagements, between deals, and the sort of ongoing interactive nature of that relationship, how to keep those things sticky, over time. Absolutely. There potentially, if we were to go and study in the same way we did in B2B sales, I think there's a reason why things like the debater is waning in effectiveness. We know for sure that's true in professional services, or perhaps I should say, in professional services, we know it's different enough that this person who constantly feels the need to be the contrarian, perhaps when the product is their own expertise, over time, it just starts to rub the customer wrongly. We know that's now true in professional services. I can't tell you whether that was also true 10 years ago or not, but we know it's true there now. But I also think just anecdotally and based on some of our most recent research, I think if you went to study this in B2B sales, you'd find similar aspects. I mean, the JOLT seller, and now we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, does kind of wear this hat of, look, I'm going to try to look out for your best interests at all times. And but I'm going to do this in a way where it feels like I'm kind of pulling my chair around to that side of the table. And so they look to kind of show the buyer that they think they have things under control, and less that they're kind of taking control, if you will. So it's a stylistic, shift perhaps, but I don't want to overdo it. I don't have tons of data that tells you that those things don't necessarily work. I'm just sort of reading the tea leaves, if you will.
Got it. All right. So diving into the JOLT effect, I'll certainly link the Amazon page in the show notes, as well as your websites at DCM and Selling Innovations. I'd like to think I've probably driven sales of several hundred copies for you. I talk about it all the time. I've bought it for people.
Well, thank you for that. Our publishers would thank you for that, really, quite honestly. Yeah.
I even led and organized an executive reading group around it in late 22. And there was a really interesting case study that came out of that around the take the risk off the table, where one of the participants that had struggled with new technology around welding safety actually figured out some ways to take risk off the table and grew their sales. So that was kind of cool to see it in real life like that.
Yeah.
So the JOLT acronym has four different pieces. The first, judge the degree of indecision. The O is offer a recommendation. L is limit the research, so your buyers don't mind screw it and talk themselves out of doing something. And then the T is take risk off the table. Is there one of those that's most important?
It's interesting. They're all interconnected. I think for most people, look, I guess there's two ways I can answer that. For people, and we can kind of back up for those that aren't as familiar with the study itself, but making the recommendation, that sort of mindset of making a recommendation and then setting proper expectations, the JOLT seller kind of approaches those as almost like a first principles approach to sales, right? And so we talk in our sales training programs, we'll tell people, look, do no harm. You're not going to do any harm by making a recommendation. There's almost no customer that will ever get upset with you for having a recommendation. In fact, if you haven't yet made one in every deal, you should go back and consider what that recommendation is. So all things being equal, that's a great place to start. But I will say that the judging level of indecision is a pretty foundationally important skill as you start to really get better at this. And this is for two reasons. One is knowing more about the nature and the size of that indecision helps me in a lot of selfish ways. It helps me to qualify that business with more precision. Are they ever going to come to a decision or not? And that's a big impact on my time, right? But also allows me to forecast with a lot more precision as well. How fast and how likely are they to make this decision, which also wastes potentially my manager's time, my owner's time, all sorts of people in my organization if we're chasing after the wrong business or counting on this thing to come in this quarter or this year if it's not going to. Now, understanding more about that then also should make your pursuit more efficient as well, because you're going to learn a little bit more about the type of indecision that they might have. And so therefore I know, all things being equal, what's the play I should go and run as a way to reduce that core fear of messing up that's driving that indecision.
And your data is amazing. with low levels of indecision, there's a 45 to 55% win rate. With high levels, the win rate is only 5%. And 87% of all sales conversations show signs of indecision. Were you startled how high that is?
Absolutely, yeah. So 80, the number is 87% have either high or moderate levels of indecision. So there are 13% of buyers out there who have low levels of indecision. And if you can find them, sell them everything you can. But unfortunately, there's just not enough of them in order for us to make our number. Now we'll say, so yeah, the number itself was kind of staggering. Although if you step back and just think about how indecision affects all of us on a day-to-day basis, and buying anything from movie tickets to items on a restaurant menu, perhaps it shouldn't be all that surprising. But the thing that was I think most surprising to us in the study was, early on we could see a lot of losses happening in places where you wouldn't have expected them to happen. Okay. Where it seemed like the buyer was inclined to purchase, things seem to be kind of going pretty well in general. They've expressed some intent to purchase. They've even selected that vendor. So if they're going to buy from anyone, they're going to buy from that provider, and the seller was doing all the things that previously we would have assumed are enough to get through that sale. Creating a burning platform for change, making sure they're sizing that problem and showing them the pain if they don't change and all that good stuff. And yet the buyer was still getting stuck. So that was the most surprising thing for us, because what's going on here? This should have been a slam dunk and it's still getting stuck.
So if we boil it all down, it feels to me like we come to what you mentioned earlier, this FOMO, this fear of messing up, or more indelicately, maybe FOFU. Talk about really the essence of this FOMO.
Yeah. So at a high level, our study found that 40 to 60% of deals are ending in no decision. Some of that is due to the buyer deciding, I prefer what I'm doing today, or change is just too hard and annoying, and I'd rather just stick with what I'm doing. Preference for status quo. It's about 44% of why buyers decide to do nothing at all. Okay. But 56% of it is rooted in this indecision due to fear of failure. Now, those aren't super different, right? 56 versus 44%. But this second cause, this indecision cause, is something that we didn't even fully appreciate existed. And it turned out to be the bigger of the two. Now, we could see it happening in the data, but we couldn't yet explain why it was happening. So we turned to decades worth of psychology and behavioral economics. Matt is the person who shouldered much of that burden. So he would tell you that he wouldn't wish that on anyone. And we've gone and summarized quite a bit of those academic articles, but super enlightening in general, of course. And eventually we came across a psychological phenomenon, of course, that we had some familiarity with, but didn't know enough about yet, which is this notion of loss aversion or omission bias. It's made famous by Kahneman and Tversky, Nobel Prize winning economists and behavioral psychologists. And so a lot of people are familiar with this phenomenon, right? Because this is why so many of us use that FOMO appeal in sales. Hey, buy now or you're going to miss out. Or if you don't move now and act now, you're going to miss all these potential great things for your business or solving these problems. We care more about avoiding losses than we care about upside gain.
And we feel losses more acutely than we feel the gains. I think 4x or something like that.
That's right. Yeah. So it's this is the championship coach who can't sleep at night, even though they won 7 championships because they lost the game last night. Right. This is something that happens to a lot of us. Now, we've known that to be true, but there's a wrinkle in their research that becomes really important, especially when a buyer gets stuck. And it's this error of omission. So what they found is actually there's 2 types of losses. You can have an error of omission, which I did not do something and I missed out. So I didn't go to the party and I missed out. Or I didn't buy that solution. I didn't buy that tractor or that piece of capital equipment. And I, now I'm regretting it because I need 10 more of these things, right? That's a fear of missing out. But what they found is there's this error of commission. That's I did do something, it went horribly wrong, and I got blamed. Right? It's a very personal form of loss because it only occurred because I made that decision, and I'm of course now the person that everyone's pointing their fingers to. Right. This piece of equipment doesn't work the way that they said it was. It takes way too many people to train people to use it. It breaks all the time. Like all sorts of things go wrong, and people start pointing fingers. And what they found is psychologically, that actually weighs heavier on us as individuals. So this now started to make a lot of sense to us, right? Because we could see these losses happening in places that shouldn't have been happening, but it was because the fear of messing up outweighs that fear of missing out. Or to your point, the FOMU, right? Which is the not safe for work version of it. And this is the, hey, your 10% discount matters less to me than my job, or how I'm seen internally, or the political clout that I have, or the baggage I've brought from all these previous purchases gone wrong. This weighs super heavy on people and creates all this paralysis.
And that's like the iceberg. I think salespeople often think, okay, what I'm selling is $1 million, and there's a clear justification why the $1 million makes sense, but they don't stop to think about the perspective of, the plant manager or the regional VP who says, okay, we're going to put that in, and the plant shuts down for 2 weeks because it just doesn't work. I mean, that is a massive career-ending mistake. It's not the $1 million. Nobody wants to waste $1 million, but it's the much bigger implication.
That's right. Yeah. So I guess maybe put differently, B2B buyers tend to be a little less rational than we might otherwise think, right? We tend to think about, hey, it's the business case, makes total sense, right? The dollars and cents all line up, and we've addressed all your concerns from a value perspective. Fine, and that's all fine and good. But the emotional side of that purchase matters a lot, and they do fear, whether they articulate it or not, whether they even know that it's affecting them or not. This fear that something's going to go wrong, and that when it goes wrong, the consequence would be very high for me individually or for my team or what have you. And so better to just kind of wait it out. Now, we can get into it. There are some specific fears that manifest through the sales process there, but at root, that's kind of what's happening.
So underlying that, I think the indecision is driven, if I understand correctly, by 3 different kind of fundamental groups. There's concern, geez, there's so many options. How do we get to what we really need? Not too much, not too little is going to help us achieve what we want. So there's vacillation about the overwhelming number of options. Feeling like there might be some other information out there somewhere that if they just keep looking, then suddenly it's the Rosetta Stone, so they'll know for sure they're making the right decision. And then worrying about, you talk through a lot of the potential situations where you decide to do something and then for some reason it just goes sideways. And why might it go sideways? Is that a fair distillation of the 3 areas of indecision?
Yeah, we call those purchase drivers of indecision. So when somebody goes to make a purchase, these are 3 fears that pop up, and they wouldn't have popped up except for the fact that they're now evaluating a purchase, which means it is kind of purchase specific, right? They might feel one way in a certain purchase and another way in another one. But yeah, we call it options overload, information overload, expectations overload. So even after I decide to make that purchase, there's all these potential configurations and packages and timeframes and onboarding and users and training and all these things I have to make decisions on.
Right.
And they can't make sense of where to start. They get stuck. Information overload is this, again, not very rational thing, which is it feels like I don't yet have enough information. I'm not yet a fully informed purchaser, in spite of the fact that I have access to tons and tons of information, right? And they've been provided all sorts of information at the same time. And they feel like there's some surprise hidden around some corner that I need to keep looking for. And then expectations overload is really about outcomes remain far too uncertain. I don't yet have enough assurance, even though you've provided plenty, case studies and reference calls and all sorts of ways to try to assure me. But nonetheless, I feel like other organizations might have had a good experience with change. We don't. And so we can't really achieve all the expectations that we've just laid out there.
Now, when I first read the book, and as I've thought about it for several years since, I've envisioned a Rubicon where FOMO, we work as salespeople to drive the FOMO up. We get the buyer excited. They believe they need to undertake the change. But then suddenly the FOMO kicks in. And I mean, I understand the point in the book that if we double down on the FOMO, we actually, not only do we not have a positive effect, but we've got a massive negative effect. I'd love for you to talk about those stats, but I also think I may have misunderstood based on more recent stuff I've read from you, where you say this can develop at any time in the sales cycle and persist throughout the entire sales cycle. So I thought it was something that kind of spiked, but it sounds like I misunderstood.
So it's kind of both. Let's take those one by one. So yes, indecision is something that can affect a buyer at any point in the decision process. You can start detecting it from the very first moment that you meet with a buyer, partly because those 3 purchase-related factors of indecision are actually only part of the indecision picture. So there are psychological factors that make certain people just more or less indecisive. But then there are also conditional specific things that, baggage the buyer may have brought in from previous implementations or purchases gone wrong can weigh on them from the very beginning on the assumption anything around this is hard and going to go wrong and I'll get blamed for it. Right. Political internal situations in that organization could affect this from the beginning. Now, that doesn't mean that early on as a seller, my primary objective is still to try to get them to want that change and feel like they need that change. But it does mean I need to think about both from the very beginning and treat both throughout the process. And so, there is some complexity then involved in terms of making sure this isn't a sequential thing. Mm-hmm. It's not like I have this luxury of like only dealing with the fear of messing up once I've put the other one to bed, but rather these things run in tandem across the process.
And talk about the deleterious impact that you've seen where when we hear that FOMO, we go back and double down on the FOMO and it just blows things up.
Yeah. So think about it like this. At a certain point, your buyer has some desire and some intent to purchase. And often they might have even come to that conclusion on their own before they've even met with you, right? They know this is a need. They've selected a certain number of potential providers and now they're talking to you. But at some point, they've kind of come to that conclusion. At that point, though, fear of messing up starts to really amp up because now they're into the diligence phase. They're testing out all your promises made. They're starting to get overwhelmed with the number of options and all these things. And so what happens is if we go back to actually, let me rephrase. What happens for the seller is that any sort of hesitation that happens at that point, any sort of backtracking, any sort of black holing or what have you, they interpret that hesitation as a problem with persuasion. Right? The assumption is, well, they must not want it enough. They're saying they want it, but they must not, because if they did really want it, they'd be showing up to these calls or they'd be advocating on our behalf or what have you. And so what they do then is they go back to the well and they try to relitigate that case for, don't you know how bad you need us or how painful is this situation? And for the buyer, what that feels like is you're taking an already fearful customer and you're throwing more fear on top of it. And so from a data perspective, it ends up backfiring. It makes it more likely that they retrench and do nothing at all.
Do you have any data on whether the way that companies buy themselves and discuss those purchase decisions and the way they go about it and the way they think about it and managing risk and that kind of thing, any data on how that correlates with the way they find their customers behave with them? I mean, I kind of have this idea that if you as a company are very risk averse, you don't make decisions, you put a lot of things off, you suffer from indecision, then your salespeople probably think that's quite normal when their prospects have that with them.
I'm laughing in part because I've had a couple clients lately that sell to attorneys, to law firms. And what they find is that information overload in particular for them is a high problem because they're used to doing tons of diligence for their clients. And so they put that diligence hat on as a purchaser, and now all of a sudden they're into analysis paralysis. So I certainly think that that's a possibility. You absorb a sort of mentality or a sort of risk aversion that translates into, buyers I don't think about their world as like, okay, let me take my doer hat off and put my buyer hat on, right? This is just who they are as an executive, and they bring all their learned experiences to that. I mean, I think the same thing is true. We sometimes talk about when you go to buy something on Amazon. I mean, you can imagine quite literally, you could have a buyer who, especially in this day and age where you've got a Zoom meeting, they have one tab open where they've got some Amazon thing that they can't decide if they're going to purchase, and they hop over the other tab to join that Zoom meeting, right? It's the same browser, within the 10-minute span. And so, I can't tell you for certain that they're going to separate those things and say, okay, now I want to be decisive. I think more generally, though, those options overload, information overload, expectations overload is something that tends to be purchase specific and situationally specific. Those other elements of organization dysfunction, decision making breaking down, risk aversion in general, those are more conditional factors that can exacerbate indecision, and I certainly want to take that into consideration. But if I'm giving advice to a seller, I want to take those types of things into account as I qualify and forecast that piece of business. but I have more control over limiting the degree to which the fear of messing up happens in those three big fears, if that makes sense, right? So it doesn't mean I walk away from that piece of business because of it. I want to be aware of it, but it makes it even more necessary to make sure that those three fears don't pop.
So in most of the JOLT Effect, as I read it, it talks about what sellers need to do, the mistakes sellers make, how sellers need to compensate, what preemptive actions they should take. But a lot of the buying journey happens before sellers are involved. What's marketing's role in preempting the FOMO?
Yeah. I just did another podcast with a marketing audience yesterday, and they were asking these types of questions. And look, I think the knowing more about the emotion that goes into these decisions, should of course be a high on the radar of any marketer. And it should be factored into the collateral that we're producing. The support that we provide needs to go beyond just the ROI calculator and beyond the rational business case. The organization in general, whether it's more sales enablement or marketing, I think can play a big role in helping with things like making recommendations, which is a big part of showing that buyer that you're willing to shift some of that perceived blame from them to you. So giving that seller kind of a starting point or a head start, if you will, of what is a great recommendation is a good thing for marketing to kind of consider what are some packages or ways that I can kind of help that story and help it along.
Right.
The other thing I would think about if I was a head of marketing is, we care a lot about naturally, attribution and making sure that we're getting through to a close. Well, the cheapest path to getting more business these days is, in fact, turning more out of your existing pipeline. You don't have to go find those new leads, right? So I would sort of avoid that assumption that I need to pour more money into the top of the funnel and just look for new leads. I'm sure that's, of course, it's probably a both and, right? It's not either or, but
Sure.
Nonetheless, like what the data tells us is that if we can get better at reducing that fear of messing up and increase win rates by even a couple of points, the return for you as a marketer, I have to imagine, would be quite considerable. So, again, ways to just continue to support that and pretty much just be careful of pouring more fear, more pain on those bad situations and making people aware of kind of what's happening.
And what about the reverse? What about very deliberately affirming some concerns? I mean, very explicitly outlining on the company's website or in collateral the kinds of companies or situations that aren't a great fit, and maybe that gets too much into your activator argumentative or whatever you called it, or maybe a pre-mortem guide. Everyone talks about the guide to buying it. How about a pre-mortem guide that takes people through the reason things might not go well and just get those out on the table and allow that to foster conversation so that people don't allow those things to fester? Is there any value to that?
I think so. This is a question we often get in classrooms from sellers is like, well, if I bring up these fears, isn't that going to feed the fear? And it's like, look, at the end of the day, that buyer is going to experience this or feel this one way or another. And so better to get ahead of it and raise that. I think there's something to be said, though, for that being more of a conversation than a piece of collateral on a website, which, you may be misinterpreted. I will say, though, that in general, if I'm developing case studies, for example, I don't want just value stories themselves and success stories. Of course, those remain very important. But also, if I can demonstrate that we've thought through and learn from the experience of other customers, and as a consequence, this reflects how we now work with buyers, that's a confidence-giving thing on its own, right? So you've reduced the potentially in the buyer's mind, you've reduced the frequency of those potential mess ups if you kind of thought those through and they're represented in your process. The other thing I'd say about the website, though, I should have mentioned this earlier, is, in many ways, marketers naturally, and I think understandably, love options and choice, and guess even the research will tell you that there is a time and a place for that people actually are attracted to choice. We like the concept of choice. So it brings people in the door and they like having but when it comes to making decisions, it can be paralyzing in nature. And so we need to be really careful about balancing that. And not throwing millions of options on our website and tons of SKUs out there, right? and be a contributor to this overwhelming feeling for the sales team.
Speaking of balance, there's a balance, I think, of confidence. Customers want to work with salespeople who are confident, who exude that confidence and build trust and confidence in the buyer that they understand the situation, can help solve it. On the other hand, they're distrustful of sellers who overdo that. How can sellers strike that balance?
Yeah, we call it becoming a buyer's agent. There's a chapter in the book we talk about this, and it's a really important mindset and mentality of this JOLT seller, that I have your best interest in mind. Because look, think about it from a buyer's perspective. Who among us has not felt like they've been oversold at some point? Right. And so then translate that into then what might that mean in terms of the hesitancy you might bring, or the distrust, to your point, that you might have about, they're just hiding all the bad information, right? They're only giving me the good information, and they're not telling me about, they're only telling me about products that have great stories, but not so much about the pieces that there's some variability in the experience, or what have you. So, and even your point on the fit thing is a good part, right? A good buyer's agent sort of mentality there is, look, I want to be very upfront about buyers that work really well with us and buyers that don't. And if you're one of those other buyers, you know what? There's other places that you can have a great experience. But here's how we work really well with clients. It's a very buyer's agent type thing. But to your point, it's rooted in this notion of, look, I have to earn back trust right from the beginning. The buyer walks in distrustful, not of me, but of the sales process in general, because again, who among us hasn't been oversold in the past? So my job is to earn back some of that trust, and then perhaps spend it a little bit in certain places, which is a little bit of that radical candor at certain points. I might have to call time out and help that buyer understand, you know what? I think you're kind of heading the wrong path, and here's why. Right. And that's where you start to spend a little bit of that.
But what it sounds like you're talking about is, rather than trying to differentiate your business, your product, your service based on technical features, you're differentiating yourself and your company based on how you sell.
Very much so. And that's data we've known for a long, going back, for those in your audience that know the Challenger sale, we've known for a long time that, a big driver of loyalty is in fact about the degree to which you can deliver a great sales experience, and less so about the technical features of your product or what have you, or at least in the buyer's eyes, those things are less differentiating on a relative basis. But yeah, I think that's especially true though as you get into senior people that you look to buy, right? So, and this is a problem our customers run into all the time, which is, especially when we get like very comfortable in the technical know-how and the technical features of our product, or the new innovation that we put into these parts or into this, it's all fine and good, and buyers want that, of course. But what often happens is you either get pushed down to the more junior people in the organization whose entire job is that stuff, right? And so now we get too comfortable talking about that and not enough about the business outcomes that the organization wants. Or we end up with a very technically focused a sort of sales process, which lends itself to that analysis paralysis, right? And the other thing is, we end up, because they then get in the weeds, we have to then start deferring to other people to bring in some of that expertise and convey that expertise, because there's only so much a seller can understand about all this sort of ins and outs. And there's danger there too, right? And
at that point, if they try to limit research, it probably comes across as defensive as opposed to helpful.
Yeah. So the way I would think about it, so the outcome here is we call limiting the exploration. That does not mean we're like quite literally trying to limit the amount of stuff that we send to them, but it does mean that I need to convey some expertise along the way and do what we call owning the flow of information. So I'm trying to convey to, look, I know where this train's heading. Right? I've been down this road before. You're in good hands. I've done homework on your behalf, and it's a relief-inducing thing for that buyer. But you're right, the absence of that, it feels like, well, I am kind of on my own. No one else is going to go research this. So I'm going to need to learn everything I possibly can before I'm comfortable moving forward.
Thinking about buying teams, CEB, where you used to work, and Challenger, I think, were both responsible for really awakening the sales world to the explosion in the size of the buying team. And that creates all sorts of challenges. Not only is there the risk of appearing autocratic as a decision maker, which I think socially these days carries a stigma, but you also have buying team members that probably don't want a project to happen. And so there's concern about, will they potentially deliberately or passive aggressively sabotage the effort? So I wonder if part of what sales needs to do now is be running a JOLT methodology essentially on each member of the buying team on behalf of the decision maker or those leading the committee, so that they almost can provide this insight to help that person steer the committee in the right direction. Have you seen that?
Yeah, look, I mean, the easiest way to think about how indecision affects buying groups is you have more than one person or multiple people in the group that is showing signs of the fear of messing up or of indecision. It just amplifies or just makes it far more harder to navigate. I will say though that what often happens in practice when organizations go through training with us is what they realize is we're actually not multi-threading enough in general. And the consequence of that is we don't actually know the level of indecision for this organization. And we can't possibly because we haven't talked to enough of these people. And especially the more senior they are, the more consequential their decisions are, the more visible their decisions are. This drives this perception that there will be this blame passing when things go wrong. And when we're not even having conversations or we haven't found ways to get that intelligence even indirectly through our champion or through our advocate, what have you, it becomes far more difficult to know. And so you have all these blind spots available to you. So at minimum, yeah, go try to find out kind of where their head's at and their perspective on this direct conversation as best if you're able to and get access to it. But yeah, it does sort of require you to find ways to again get intelligence and have more direct conversation with folks.
But then, how about sharing that back with the person, the deal champion, who wants to see it happen? Is there any value in sharing with them these insights and offering recommendations of how they could kind of run the O or L or T parts of the play on their team internally?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. And yeah, it should be to their advantage if it's, they're anchored on a problem that's important for their business, right? You're trying to help them along with that. There's kind of an interesting wrinkle, and I'll give credit to a former colleague of mine named Timur Hitchelmus, who was one of the researchers on the Challenger project. And when he saw JOLT, this was one of his reactions, which is that we used to talk about the difference between mobilizers and talkers inside these buying groups. So a talker being somebody who's fully willing to give you time and intelligence, but when push comes to shove, they're not willing to actually advocate for their peers. Well, this allows us to really perhaps rethink how you might classify somebody as a talker. That actually this person is a latent advocate, but is just stuck in indecision. And so if I can help them overcome that, I potentially unlock far more numbers of potential advocates or mobilizers, which is an interesting way to think about it.
Sometimes the indecision stems from the prospect's concerns about the vendor, but sometimes it's concern about their own internal ability to execute. I hear a lot of executives say, we'd love to do it. It makes sense. We just have these 3 strategic priorities. We got to concentrate on those, or I don't have bandwidth, or my team doesn't have the bandwidth. And as much as we'd like to do it, we can't do it. Can sellers overcome both of those, or is there a difference between them?
Yeah, I think it's even worse than that, actually, because I think it's also about their perspective on their capacity or their ability to execute these things, right? That we stink at change and we can't do these things. We can't have nice things definitely affects their perspective on this. So yeah, a big part of de-risking that decision helps that buyer understand what is practical, what is achievable, what's believable for them to go about doing that. And I want to start that early and often throughout the process. For those buyers who are so concerned about those types of things, that might be a place where I have to get creative with what we'll call safety nets, where we have to find ways to actively de-risk that decision, or else it'll likely get stuck at some point. But there comes a point where when a seller, there is merit in a seller sort of determining, this buyer isn't ever going to make a decision. And so consequently, I might need to deprioritize this opportunity, or I might need to move on if I'm in a position to do it.
So we'll come back to JOLT Effect in a minute, but one of the things I always try to do when I'm chatting with people is to learn more about who they are. And I found you're actually very private online. You talk a lot about your research, but not at all about TED. Are there hobbies or interests outside of research that give you a kind of an escape valve for stress and help you recenter your karma?
Sure. Yeah, well, that's a good question. I guess perhaps that indicates I'm not myself and as much of an activator. An activator might be a little bit more public about at least how they're thinking about things, on LinkedIn, what have you. Yeah, so on a professional level, always love to connect and reconnect with colleagues. I'm fortunate to have had experience at CEB, which is not part of Gartner, because it's a very large alumni network, and so if I'm in a city, I'd love to meet up for coffee or what have you with a former colleague. On a personal basis, I'm a golfer, so I like to get out there and not very good, which maybe that's part of the reason I enjoyed it, is it's an ongoing struggle to concentrate and find ways to improve. But it's a fun way also to socialize with people and get a chance to know them as well. But yeah, other than that, pretty boring, guy spending time with family and friends, and that's about me.
That golf feels like an analog for enterprise sales. It's so complex and so infuriating in some cases, and so exhilarating in others, and a nice opportunity to have interactions with people.
Yeah, absolutely. There are, I think, people in some places that sort of, I think, assume that golf is just it is just a social thing, and then there's elements to that, but it's also like, it's a place you put your phone in the golf bag for 3 or 4 hours. You're sort of concentrating hard on getting better, and it's a fun way to kind of unplug, if you will.
One thing that I've found is that even sophisticated companies don't seem to typically do a good job closing the loop on the back end. So in other words, once they've implemented something, when it's gone smoothly and none of those concerns that might potentially lead to indecision have been justified, they need to capture that and make that case internally and reassure and celebrate the people that made the decision and capture that for a case study. And if things went wrong, certainly they need to capture that, as you talked about in terms of the case studies. Should vendors force this? Should they upfront, as part of a project plan? I know one of the take risk away elements is to provide a project plan so people understand the steps that are involved. Should they put in there, hey, at the end, we're going to collect the data and we're going to confirm that you made the right decision?
So it's a tricky question. I think, we get asked questions often about, how does indecision affect current customers and renewals and upsell, cross-sell opportunities? And the short answer is those are new decisions also. And so it definitely affects them for sure. And if it's a current customer of mine, I certainly want to make sure, just like any good customer success person would want to find ways to remind the buyer about promised value being realized. In the same respect, if I'm promising great experiences and setting proper expectations, and those things are realized as well, I want to remind them that, in fact, the expectations you set out were believable, practical, and achievable, and you did that. So, it's a sort of a low regret play, if you will. I'm trying to demonstrate to them that there was low regret, and now I'm taking credit for the fact that, in fact, the fear of messing up was unwarranted or more perceived than actual. So absolutely. The other thing I'd say, though, is that we can kind of get ahead of some of this in the sales process by pulling forward, some of the processes that most organizations have in place to initiate that, right? So checkpoints and check-in calls and account management processes that, of course, are there for renewal purposes, but take credit for them in the sales process as a way to show them, like, we've thought through and have put in place processes to reduce the likelihood of that mess up. And it's this, and it's that, and it's this. And I think it's totally appropriate to, again, take credit for that and share that. It is a form of a safety net. It might be rather informal. It's not the same as, something where you're quite literally taking risk off the table with a cancellation clause or something like that. But nonetheless, it is a form of a safety net for that person.
So upsell and cross-sell is one thing, but kind of rip and replace is something different. And in the machine world, they may have 4 or 5 of an incumbent's machine on the floor. And so there's a decision, do we need to buy another? Do we add capacity? Do we replace one? But there's also this omission, commission point that you made earlier, if they decide to get another and to get something different, then there's a real risk. What they have now, it's not perfect. Nothing's perfect, but it's okay. And that is something that people in my space really struggle with. What kind of insights do you have for that situation?
Yeah, is that sort of what I have is good enough at the moment?
Yeah, and if we've got to add capacity, we've got 5 of the same machine. We've got the spare parts inventory. Our maintenance team is trained on it. We've got the drawings, or people know how to fix it. We can change people between shifts and plants, and they can take it over. So there's a lot of potential downside if you go to something different. And if an engineer says, let's go different, and it turns out well, they're just doing their job. If they say, let's go different, and it turns out poorly, then, they're a jerk.
Yeah, the current state is a business process they understand too, right? So what happens if it does need maintenance or it does break? And then I've got people on my floor who have know-how about dealing with those situations. Whereas if I change platforms or change providers or move to a different version or the upgraded version, now all of a sudden I got to retrain my team on what that process is. I got to make sure that they understand everything. And because they don't, the potential consequence of any mess up is that much higher, right?
Sure.
Lost time on the floor, consternation and frustration. Do people leave because now they have to spend all this time? Yeah. So the ripple effects can be quite big. And I think, I guess that's the bad news, I suppose, if you are the person who's trying to convince the buyer to make that change.
Mm-hmm.
But I would, the data would show that if you take that into consideration and recognize that change that you're proposing is not just a one-time thing, but these follow-on ripple effects and these implications. And if I can holistically help them understand the ways that you've surrounded that support, you're going to sell far more of those things.
Interesting. I saw in the news yesterday, IBM had an earnings call, and I think the quote was, in a very dynamic and uncertain environment, clients are focused on cost efficiency, cash preservation, and liquidity. And the Wall Street Journal article went on to say the companies have reprioritized away from discretionary-based projects. And that kind of raised 2 questions as I was thinking about this conversation. Number one, your research for the JOLT Effect was conducted in the midst of COVID. And, we've got loads of economic, market, and geopolitical uncertainty right now. But this indecision problem isn't driven, if I understand correctly, exclusively by outside events. They may aggravate it, but it is a fundamental internal issue even when times are good, right?
That's right. Yeah. So it actually, you could see it's sort of in a secular increase over time because of those 3 big fears: options overload. Who has less options for their buyers? Everyone's got more options for their buyers. Information overload is only getting worse with AI and chat GPT and what have you. And then expectations overload is often driven by suppliers because we want to do and sell transformative things to our buyers, which sounds great, but then are also hard and difficult. You're right, though, that the external conditions that can create budget uncertainty or budget crunches can exacerbate underlying levels of indecision. So in and of itself, it's not a driver of indecision, but it can take otherwise low levels of indecision and make them feel far worse. If you think about it like this, when there's less money to go around, more eyeballs are on the resources that I have available to you. And of course, more fingers get pointed when you misuse those funds in those situations. So the scrutiny itself and potentially the time pressure that might be associated with it does increase the perception of, hey, if things mess up, I'm screwed, basically, and I'm out of a job. But company has less money, things go wrong, people start getting fired.
Right. So all that being said, the point is that anybody hoping they can buckle their seatbelt and go back to a typical buying environment once the tariffs are resolved in Q3 or whatever is probably misunderstanding how fundamentally this problem of indecision plagues complex purchasing.
Yeah, look, I mean, this will sound self-serving. I'll grant you, but we dealt with this not just in COVID, but just after that, different audience than your audience. But in the SaaS market in 2022, the sort of things went off the cliff for a bit there as well. And look, I guess I'd say the fear of messing up is a phenomenon that every seller in the world needs to understand. In general, whether it's in good times or bad. In times of uncertainty, though, I would argue it's even more important. Because the perception that buyer has is going to get scrutinized and and it will exacerbate some of these underlying trends.
There's another factor that it feels to me like is important. Companies feel some things are nice to have. Yeah, our operation would improve if we could do that, but it's okay as it is, versus must have. And it feels, my gut tells me that the indecision probably manifests itself more disruptly in the nice to have category. Any thoughts?
That's probably a fair hypothesis. I will say, in general, though, that options overload in particular is a place where buyers really struggle. When buyers are gripped by that fear, they really struggle to be able to make that distinction. Right. So everything feels like a must have, right? Like they can't separate the nice to haves versus the need to haves. And so because of that, it's kind of like, and it's difficult for the seller because, you get a buyer who's saying, well, I like this and I like that and this looks great. And they go on the showroom floor, right? And it's like, that shiny thing and this shiny thing. Can I get in this? Can I drive this? And it's like, I'm going to sell them everything I have. Fine, except for the fact what that demonstrates is they cannot make those trade-offs in their mind. And so they start to get overwhelmed really easily. So all things being equal, I want to help that buyer with those trade-offs one way or another. But you're right. If the buyer's already coming to that conclusion on their own, far easier.
So I contend often in the world where I work and many of my clients work that sometimes it's not no decision, but that the sellers just don't know where the decision happened. I mean, I've got kind of this 5 decision framework where first a company has to decide, yes, we're going to put some resources into evaluating this problem, seeing what the options are. Second, we're going to decide whether or not we should request capital. Third, we're going to make a decision about whether or not to approve capital and where this gets stack ranked on the on the list. 4, we're going to decide how we're going to select a vendor. And 5, we're going to select the vendor. And salespeople often get fixated on selecting the vendor, never move up in the organization, never have the business conversation, never understand how the capital is being decided. And in many cases, their deal champions don't either. So sometimes I think there are decisions made. We just don't realize it. Do you, any reaction to that?
Yeah, so I kind of wish my co-founder and business partner was on the line here because this is sort of his big hobby horse, if you will. So our latest research is sort of looking at what does a jolter do across the full cycle, right? Even when their primary objective is to try to sell and create demand for that change, they still have that jolter hat on when they jump into those conversations. And I think if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, is they need to have a better sense for what is the typical sort of, for lack of a better way of saying it, the planning process that organizations have for allocating resources and making decisions, right? And if I can insert my frame of reference into that process and be mindful of that, which for a jolter, it sort of is very much in keeping with setting proper expectations, where I'm being practical and believable about what's happening at this juncture, at this point in the year with these people and fitting this into their decision-making structure. It becomes not only easier to evaluate, but more likely they're going to make a decision.
Right.
So we put it a little differently, but absolutely you need to be recognize and be mindful of, how do they make decisions? When do they make decisions? What's the process for it and so forth?
One of the things I think that your bio talks about that your research goes into is how directors interpret situations and react. And often these capital investment decisions may need to get rubber stamped. Maybe it's not an in-depth discussion of every project at the board level, but the board's involved. Do you find people that actually take the JOLT methodology and apply it even beyond the executive suite to the board?
Yeah. So in general, as I said earlier, I guess 2 things with respect to boards. One is, if there's one body in the organization, maybe perhaps aside from like the chief risk officer who cares about risk, it's going to be the board,
right?
In different ways. Now, does that always funnel down to everything that they're purchasing? It depends on the organization, I think, and depends on the market. But to the extent that a seller can channel the way that a CEO or a C-suite individual is making decisions in view of the things the board cares about, the more likely they are to to be able to move some of those initiatives along and recognize the perceived risk inside their organization. I don't know that all sort of a JOLT mentality itself. I think in general, that's just good sales hygiene is to think about how do I anchor this in the broader objectives of the business and not get sort of into the weeds of the technical features. But I do think, gosh, boardrooms these days must be quite interesting with all the global uncertainty. And, you'd have to imagine risk is a very high on the agenda for many of them.
Right. Yeah. And not just risk, but uncertainty. And we haven't talked about uncertainty, but I think, that's a whole nother question because there is no answer to the uncertainty piece. We can address some of the risk. We can mitigate some of the risk. We can't address the uncertainty.
Yeah, I wish I had the, trust me, if I had the magic wand in there, I would wave it. But yeah, I think uncertainty in many respects has been on the rise for a while and now feels like it couldn't be any higher at this point. I guess, from a sales perspective, this is, look, at the end of the day, though, organizations have objectives they're trying to accomplish for this year. If you can find ways to attach the word AIs to your to your offering, that might unlock some budget there. But you could also argue that drives a lot of uncertainty too. When you're selling new technology and you're selling uncertain new things, you can imagine how that would exacerbate things too.
I think that's
oversold technology in the past. Go ahead.
That's a point that you made in your article on Keenan's Revenue magazine last fall, where you talked about the uncertainty surrounding new technology creates different and more objections, often rooted in fear rather than value. So that was in the context of AI, but that's broadly applicable.
Certainly, anytime that you're selling sort of a new technology thing, everyone has perspective on, hey, am I buying this before it's really ready for prime time, right? Is this thing fully tested? Is it been vetted by others? Are you overselling its capabilities? And I think with respect to AI, it's fair to assume that there's going to be some bubble somewhere, driven by some individual. And that doesn't mean there aren't others who are making perfectly valid claims. But if you're the buyer, you now have to separate, one from the other. And so you can imagine why that would create more need for more diligence and wanting to dot every I and cross every T in the process for sure.
I love debating whether enterprise salespeople should work to qualify deals in or qualify them out. I come down on the side of qualifying them out. And I think, admitting that bias, the way I read your guidance about judging the degree of indecision, it feels to me like this is a consistent process of qualifying deals out as you discover that the indecision is insurmountable.
We've known to research for a while that high performers are far more rigorous and ruthless about disqualification and walking away from deals. Easier said than done. If you're an average seller and you're, or just a new salesperson for your territory and you're just trying to make sense of what's what, or you have an inbound lead come in and you're going to chase after that, right? Or if you're in a key account territory and you don't have the luxury of walking away from some of those deals. So that might be about reprioritizing your time. But I think you have to, what's new about this research though, is it adds a dimension to that disqualification. That is not just their ability to buy, but their ability to make a decision at all. And I think the hardest part for the average seller is, I have this buyer who seems very excited, but might never make a decision. And can I walk away from those situations? It's got to be very, very difficult in those situations, which is why it's true. We believe that you probably should think about disqualifying, but talk to your manager about it. But at minimum, think about reforecasting that opportunity. Like consider that in terms of timing at minimum for your organization.
Turn down the gain on your sales happy years at least.
Exactly right. Yes, that's right.
Your background and acumen was, I think, one of the pieces that enabled the JOLT Effect research. Bringing Tether in and being able to run analysis on all these unstructured conversations was really a key element of making that all possible. And it feels like now, with all the AI sales agents that are coming along that can mine conversations and emails and text messages and all, there may be a way to begin to overlay JOLT criteria on top of MEDIC or MEDPIC or, whatever qualification criteria people use, and have those agents begin to look for these things. Is anyone doing that or doing it well?
So that's a complicated question. I mean, there are things we work with clients on those types of things at times. Whenever you're evaluating the buyer side of the conversation, it gets far more complex because the variation in those emotions and objections can be quite high. Unstructured data can only be analyzed as good as you can classify it.
Right.
And so that creates some complexity. We were fortunate to work with a really good piece of technology that Matt and I happened to be working there at the time. And we'd spend years kind of training the machine to recognize these situations. More generally, though, you're absolutely right that like the advancements in AI will unlock new opportunities to understand more about what's happening in these conversations. I think when we go to provide guidance to people on this, what we tell them is, be careful about more about false negatives than false positives. So it's easy early on to spot errors and say, oh, this shouldn't be that, or this classified. Fine, you have to get better at that. But what's tougher is the false negatives, where it's not recognizing things at all and it's off your radar.
Right.
And there are ways around that analytically, but that's where I would kind of focus a lot of energy.
And if you had one or two questions that you would put in a typical win-loss report to try to capture JOLT elements, what would you be asking in those win-loss reports?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, first, I think often win-loss analysis really more win analysis than it is loss analysis. Partly because it's based off of surveys or interviews of customers, and it's easier and more comfortable to get those answers from people that we've won business from than people we've lost business from. But on the loss side, I think there's definite opportunity for rev ops or sales ops or whoever to think, about phantom deals that are sitting, phantom pipeline that's kind of sitting in your CRM system that really is dead, but it hasn't been called dead yet. So these are open, 2, 3, 4 times the typical cycle time. Days between stages is another way to think about losses. Call them effective no decision losses. At some point, call the ball and say, look, this thing is dead on the doorstep here. But as you look at like actually true losses, I would really think hard about what percentage of that could you chalk up to this was either a competitive loss to a buyer deciding to keep what they're doing now, or it was they just ghosted us and went away. Those things are different.
Or there was never really institutional support for the project and somebody was doing their own, exploration, hoping to look like a hero, and they just got no traction.
Yeah, I'd probably classify that as a status quo loss, that they probably didn't want it enough, even if one person did.
Is there any way to use the FOMU offensively? In other words, if you're helping somebody compare solutions, not necessarily direct competitors, but there's multiple ways that companies can solve things. Can you position some of those solutions they're considering in the context that may elevate FOMU and do that safely for yourself?
So the short answer is yes. The longer answer is, but when done so, make sure you do it as a buyer's agent, along the way.
Got it.
You're not doing it as a way to throw other suppliers under the bus.
Right.
That you're not doing it in a transparently obvious way to give advantage to you as a supplier. But certainly, especially if the other one is the incumbent, and they are creating some degree of mess up, or there has been some degree of mess up, I think it's appropriate to point out that, in fact, you're the less risky option in that situation. If you have a competitor who does create all sorts of downstream, uncertainty because of, hey, they talk about short-term costs, but not long-term costs, or there's, ripple effects that go, certainly I should be bringing that up, right? These are factors that could influence the consequence of a mess up. So certainly I would think about being offensive about that. Yeah. Sorry, let me rephrase. Not being offensive about that, playing offense with it.
Understands.
Yeah.
You get really busy around the beginning of the year. A lot of companies roll this stuff out during SKOs. Is that the best way to do it, or can you introduce it to a team other times in other situations?
Yeah, this is a hot topic in the world of sales training. And look, naturally, a lot of training is rolled out at SKOs because that's when we have people together. I think when done best, though, this is something that starts far before that point. And look, I think in general, you would think about this as more of a business process change and a change management than you would an event. But even if you want to consider the training itself as a little bit more of a, all at a time, or maybe sheep dipping kind of them in the same room, there's still things I'd want to do 3, 5, 6 months ahead of time to lay that groundwork. Whether it's working with certain cohorts ahead of time, building some champions along in the process, getting your leaders on board. It's a whole bunch of things that if I was running it, from the start, from scratch, and trying to run it best practice, that's what I would do.
Makes sense. At Selling Innovations, I understand you're now working on more research around what you're calling high performance selling in the AI area. Short version, can you share your hypothesis or early findings? I take away the fact that you think great reps will be more valuable and average reps perhaps irrelevant or a liability. Anything you can share with us about that new research?
Well, look, for a long time, what we do is we study high performers and we try to understand the shifts that they're making because buyers are shifting in how they're buying.
Right.
And they're sort of the canaries in the coal mine. They're telling us, they're figuring out on their own. Nobody gave them a playbook. They just figured it out. That was true with Challenger. That was true with Jolt. It will be true with the next big shift. And I think it's fair to assume that AI represents the potential for, and probably the likelihood of, a next tectonic shift in how people purchase and also how they sell too. I think most people today are focused on how AI affects sellers. I think it's as interesting to think about how it affects buyers.
Sure.
In the degree to which they're using research to select vendors or get recommendations, and what that does to the trust that they have coming into the conversation, the nature of the conversation itself when they go to have that first conversation with a seller. And so, yeah, we are certainly interested in aiming some research at this and trying to understand how this will evolve. You're probably referencing one specific hypothesis that we have out there, which is, as more of the tooling becomes available to sales organizations, that makes some of the types of very common but kind of rote type stuff easier and more efficient. Account planning, to be, as one example, pre-call research,
Right.
maybe being another one. It does, of course, make that potential for that seller to be more efficient, but it also removes a lot of the kind of easy stuff. And now all of their time is spent on the hard stuff. Now I have to spend all of my time on differentiation and combating, indecision and dealing with emotion and positioning and what have you. And so that will create some exposure for a seller who previously could have said, I don't have time for this, or I get sort of bogged down in chasing after our customers, where more and more of that is automated. I now get exposed a little bit more. So I do think it's fair to assume there will be a bigger and wider separation between high and average performers. But that's, of course, been true pretty much for every shift that's happened
Right.
along the way. As solution selling came in, inside selling, now I think this will happen again, but, for different reasons.
And do you have any sense of whether the high performers in one era or kind of secular methodology can succeed in remaining high performers as it goes along, or is there a rotation?
It's a good question. I guess I can't tell you with any certainty we have data that shows that it's one way or another. But I will say that I think the data would show that there have been shifts over time. Whereas in the past, the relationship builder in a pre-Challenger day might have been the one that most organizations bet their money on in terms of hiring, and now Challenger becomes, at the time, Challenger became kind of the place where let's reorient our focus there.
Right.
And there are some things that like a Jolter does that in fact Challengers would do too, in terms of bringing ideas and insight through the process and what have you. But there's a little bit of an evolution there as well. And I would tend to think about more as an evolution than a wholesale change in terms of that. Because look, at the end of the day, that's what high performers are really good at, is reading the tea leaves and figuring out, oh, there's some shift here, right? So if I was a high performer in previous era, I'm probably more likely to be a high performer in the next era too.
Makes sense. So obviously people should buy your books. They can subscribe, I think, at DCM, Selling Innovations. Where else should they go to learn more about complex sales? What resources do you offer, or where do you turn for insight yourself?
Well, first port of call, go to sellinginnovations.com, and jolteffect.com is another site we have for the book. If you're just interested in learning more about the study in the book, on that site, you'll see some free resources, I should say, some tools that you can download for free. But I'd also love to connect with anyone on LinkedIn. Well, let's have a conversation as well. It's often a place I go to learn as well. I might not post as much, which is why maybe you see see more of the private mentality, but I do read quite a bit on there as well.
And connect the dots for people, just so they understand if they're a fit. What's your ICP for Selling Innovations?
Yeah, good question. I mean, we work really well with organizations who are ambitious organizations, or looking to do to sort of grow their skill set for their team, and looking to sort of feel like they're kind of growing more and more into a world-class selling organization. Any sort of organization that's facing a newfound complexity, whether it's, hey, I'm feeling like something's changing with our buyers. We talked a lot about Indecision today, or I've got a new product that we've launched, or a new market that we're into, or, more generally, we're sort of maturing as an organization and we need some seasoning associated with that. We tend to work really well with organizations like that. But, these days it's also just, look, Indecision is really affecting our pipelines, and we need some immediate help there.
But not just in tech is the point.
Absolutely not. Yeah. So we work across all sectors, different types of organizations. We have support for different sizes organizations, as you might expect. But not just tech.
Okay. All right. Take 1 minute, 2 minutes to kind of wrap it all up for us. What do modern sellers and complex sales need to understand about how buyers are changing and how they need to adapt?
Yeah. Look, I think first we need to understand that buyers are as emotional as we all are when we go to purchase, and we get stuck, not being able to make decisions. And it's not just the rational business case that they need to make. I also need to find ways to help them overcome this fear that they might not be able to articulate, but nonetheless affects how they, whether they will mess up or not. And so in those situations, we need to be very careful not to throw more pain on top of that situation, to not assume that the reason they're hesitating is because they don't want your thing enough, but rather it's very possible they do want it, but yet there are other reasons they're hesitating. So look for ways to make sure that I'm recognizing that, and then help them overcome it as best we can. Make a recommendation for every account that you can, and then come to jolteffect.com and learn a little bit more.
Sounds good. A fabulous conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your time, Ted.
Yeah, appreciate you having me.
For everyone listening, you know the drill. Please drop a comment, share the episode, pass it along to a colleague who you think will benefit from hearing Ted's insights, and check out the links that you'll find in the show notes below. Thanks for listening to the Industrial Growth Institute podcast.